Well, good morning and happy Mama's Day. How about that? Happy Mama's Day to you wherever you're at. Maybe you're sitting next to your mom. I don't know. Maybe you're in your mama's lap. I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe you're a mama. Happy Mama's Day. So here we are. Happy Mama's Day. Happy Mother's Day. Yep. Yeah, you got mamas. That's it. You know what I'm saying? But y'all are perfect. Y'all are perfect to start to kind of ask this question because I have found that moms have a tendency to repeat themselves sometimes. You know what I'm saying? Bear with me for a second. And I don't mean repeat themselves as in like, hey, we're not listening, but that is sometimes the truth. As children, we can be a little hard of hearing sometimes. Maybe it's selective hearing is more like the truth of it. But there are phrases that moms will say or things that moms say that are just like, that's a mom thing. That's a mom thing. So I'm just curious. I'm curious. Do you happen to have, I know haven't given you a mic or anything, but do you happen to have a phrase that your mama has always said?
There's a lot of funny things that she says. We actually call them hopeisms.
Hopeisms.
Yeah,
Okay, so Lindsay's got hopeisms. I know they can't hear you, but
yeah, she says, love you muchly.
Love you muchly.
At the end.
Miss Hope, I love you muchly. Okay, I love you muchly. Hope, if you're watching this right now. And of course, Lindsay loves you muchly too. How about that? Adam, you got something your mom always says?
Yeah, I don't know if any other mom says this, but my mom loved foot massages, but she didn't call them that. She would always ask us to squeeze her feet.
Squeeze her feet.
Like,
Your mama loves foot massages, and so she would I'm just picturing this in the Pollard household. She's hanging out like, did she have a recliner or a favorite? Sit on the couch. You walk in, the Pollard boys would walk in. She'd be like, "Hey, will y'all come squeeze my feet, baby? Come squeeze my feet." Oh man, good. Hey, it's Mother's Day. So, mamas, you could probably get away right now if you turn to whoever's in the room and say, "Hey, y'all come squeeze my feet." It's Mother's Day. They're supposed to say yes. Like right now, they're supposed to say yes. Mother's Day, come squeeze my feet. Okay. Here's a few that I found. That I thought were pretty good. Said by moms. Here we go. Silence is golden unless you have kids. Then silence is suspicious. How about that? That's a good one. This one was a quote on a mom's website that I found. A quote from a mom. It said, "I licked a dark smear off my finger and then thought, whew, that's chocolate." Gross. Have you ever done that? I'm just curious. As a mom, I'm going to have a gag reflex. But I can't even think about it. But as a mom, I'm for real. As a mom, have you ever done that? You're like, oh yes, thank goodness that was chocolate. What is it? I need to move on. I got to keep going. Here we go. I like this meme. It said, when your mom voice is so loud, even your neighbors brush their teeth and get dressed. How about? That's what I'm talking about. That's right. When your mom voice is so loud, even your neighbors brush their teeth and get dressed. If you are Forrest Gump's mama, then you said life is like a box of chocolates. That's pretty good, Lindsay. That's pretty good. You never know. I can't do it. I don't know. So I guess my question this morning to you is, was there anything that your mom always said? And would you put it in the comments? And if she's got Facebook, tag her so that she is aware that you just let the whole internet world know that this is something she always said. So, Shelly, if you're at home, you need to tag Adam's mama. Does your mom have Facebook?
Yeah.
Good. You need to tag your Adam's mama and say, "Squeeze my feet." That's what I'm talking about. Right now, that's what needs to happen. But we're not going to do a message. Happy Mother's Day. Squeeze my feet. I don't know. Okay, no, we're going to have a message. Here we go. So, just a segment thing. Hey, if you're a mom and you're hanging out with us, we've got something special for you. And so we've partnered with one of our favorite local merchants here in the downtown square because we love to shop and support local. And so this week we have partnered with Noonan Mercantile to bring your Mother's Day gift. And so your gifts have been picked and all those kind of things. And so all you have to do is text the word mom, M-O-M, to 678-661-6330. You have to do it during our live gathering. And just text that one single word, as Robin kind of mentioned earlier, just M-O-M. And if you do that, then you're going to be sent a form. Fill out the form real quick, and then we will get you your instructions on how to pick up your Mother's Day gift from Noonan Mercantile. Shout out to Noonan Mercantile. Thank you so much, Rachel, for partnering with us to make this Mother's Day gift happen. So you don't want to miss that. So do that. Here I got a question. I don't know, and I can't see comments right now because I'm just staring at a camera. But I'm wondering, did anyone put in the comments that my mother always had to tell me, stop biting, right? Or don't bite, or hey, we don't bite, something like that. Maybe it was your child was bit, like your child was bit at pre-K or whatever. You know how you have those incident forms when you go in and you like get one of those forms and they, it says, hey, your kid was bit today, but they can't tell you who bit your kid, and so you like scan the room real quick, like which one is a biter. Like we're gonna be able to tell like which one of these little snots bit my baby. That's what's kind of going through your mind. Even worse if like there's still teeth marks on your kid when you pick them up and like, who bit my kid? Now, if it was old school, we're talking about old school. You can't do this no more. But if we were talking about old school pre-K, and I might know this because it happened to me when I was young, like kindergarten, 4-year-old, 3-year-old kindergarten. If I bit someone, I remember distinctly, I got bit back by my teacher. Right? Like that's what happened. Like I bit a kid and that teacher was like, hey, I'm going to teach you how to not bite. Right? And so she bit me back. You know what I'm saying? Like that's legit. I don't know. Maybe is that only me? Did you ever get bit by your teacher? Yeah. It would happen. Okay. So Lindsay and Adam say, no, absolutely not. But I'm a little older than them. I'm just not a lot older, but old enough. Either way, man, y'all are probably wondering who's my third grade teacher and you're going to like arrest her. Don't arrest her. She was sweet. It was great. Not third grade, 3-year-old pre-K. Biting, right? Right, biting. It just so happens, there's a little, hey, we shouldn't bite each other talk in today's message as we're in week 2 of Glory Days, the lessons that we learned while we were in kindergarten. What we have found is that throughout the Bible, there are moments where we kind of come across these lessons that are just innate. It's like, hey, this is the desire of Jesus, and these are not new things for us. They're just reinforced that, hey, we should continue to pursue these godly attributes of who we are as people. And we're going to talk about one particular today. But before we get there, I want to just make sure, because last week it's really important to what's going to happen kind of this week. It sets a foundation. Last week we worked through Galatians chapter 5, where there were the church planter Paul had planted a church in this region called Galatia, which is today modern-day Turkey. And on the southern part of that region of Galatia, he planted a church, and the church was doing well, and he left to go plant more churches. And once he left, this crew came in that started to distort the teaching that Paul had given them. And they had a name. They were called the Judaizers. And this crew, they came in and said, hey, yeah, Christianity's true. Jesus rose from the dead. The gospel is true. All those things are true. However, there's more to it than that. In order for you to be in good standing with God, to really embrace the resurrection of Jesus, you had to first become a Jew and kind of hold up your end of the law bargain. So the Jewish people up until that point, up until Jesus, had this law that was given, and that was everything for their life, right? And so the way that they interacted with the law was enormous. And so one of those things, and again, last week we talked about circumcision, right? That was one of the big things, was that, hey, if you're going to be a good Jew, you have to be circumcised. And so they were going around to these new Christian churches that have been planted and like, hey, fellas, good news. And if you really want to be a part of this church, I know Paul didn't tell you, but you got to get a little circumcised, you know what I'm saying? And so Paul was just like, hey, why are we doing this? And like, because that's how you get in good standing with God. And Paul's like, no. The law has been fulfilled in Jesus, in the gospel. So we don't have to live up to those expectations or those standards anymore. They don't apply to the people who are new in Christ, right? And so there was this back and forth, this law versus the grace. And eventually, of course, the grace wins. And Paul makes this case that, hey, we don't have to uphold the law anymore because grace has covered us and given us a way to God. And so with that, at the end of the day, we established two truths at the end of the last week. The first one was this: do not mess with someone's grace. In other words, don't be the person that comes in after Jesus has been doing some work and begin to tell them that, hey, there's this list of rules and regulations, and without it, your grace is void, right? Like, don't be that person that messes with someone's grace. And on the other side of it, don't allow someone to mess with your grace. Stand firm in what you know to be true about Jesus and the grace that's been given you, and just say, no, here's the deal. I understand who Jesus is, the Son of God, died on the cross. He connects me back to God because of the resurrection. So I don't have to do all of these things to have a right standing with God. The only reason I have a right standing with God is because of Jesus, right? And so we begin there. However, if we understand those specifics about what God wants for us in grace and what God doesn't want us to hold up to in terms of the law, if we truly understand that, it still puts us in a pretty difficult place in terms of our theology and the way that we interact with the world. And this is what can possibly happen. Sometimes this truth that we are covered by grace can cause problems with us. Right? So we've acknowledged, hey, we don't have to uphold the law anymore because of grace, because Jesus gives us our right standing, not what we do gives us our right standing. But when we really recognize that, it can cause problems, and that's what we begin to see as we walk through the rest of chapter 5. We see some of these problems that could arise. And so we're going to start with Galatians chapter 5, verse 13. I'll read, and we'll put it on the screen for you as well. Here we go. Paul's talking to them. He says, "You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. But do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love." And so he said, okay, here's the deal. So you're free. So you have been given freedom. Freedom from the law, freedom from all those things. You are free. However, he warns, hey, but please don't use your freedom to get yourself into some trouble, is what he's saying. Don't, and I guess we need to go into some more specifics first before we get to the trouble piece. What are we freed from? Again, it's the same thing that Paul was saying last week. You're free from the law, right? You're free from the law. The enormous list of expectations that God had put on the Jewish people, you are free from those list of expectations because Jesus has made your right standing with God. And so because of that, we're not only do we have the expectations that we're free from, we are also free from the punishment that comes from not meeting those expectations. So the expectations and the punishment that comes with not meeting them, we've been free from those, both of those. So the law no longer condemns us because of Jesus. We've been set free. That's what Paul's saying. However, what he is saying here, and we'll put this on the screen, with increased freedom comes increased responsibility. With increased freedom comes increased responsibility. Isn't that what we were told when we were learning to drive? I mean, I remember my dad distinctly saying that. Hey, Clint, now I'm going to give you some more freedom here. But with this freedom comes some increased responsibility, some greater responsibility, right? What does that mean, increased responsibility? It means that we have more options. Right? I mean, previously, before we could drive, I was stuck going wherever somebody took me, right? And so my parents could very often control what car I rode in, I mean, it was their car most of the time, right? And I'd have to go ask permission. Hey, can I go with someone to somewhere? All those things. But when I got my own car, right? Yeah, I mean, once I left, and that wheel would turn whichever street I wanted to go down, And the gas and the brake, I could just... When I got to the place I was supposed to be going, I could just keep the gas and just go right on by. Turn down another street, go to another place. I had that freedom, and it came with a little bit of responsibility, a responsibility to choose. I guess what I'm trying to say is this responsibility, though, to be clear, if we had to put it in simple terms, is it possible to willingly participate in the things that are not God-honoring and still receive grace? Yes. Yes, that's the answer to that question. Is it possible that we participate in things in our life that's not God-honoring and we still receive grace? Absolutely, yeah. And 100%, that's the whole idea, is that not only when we gave our lives to Jesus are we acknowledging that we had issues in our past, we're also acknowledging we're going to have issues in our future, and that we will still continue to participate in things that are not God-honoring. However, we understand that's why we need this grace. There's no excuse, right? There's no excuse. But it's still just the reality, right? We're not perfect people. And so he's talking about this freedom, and it gets a little ironic, I think, if we take a look at it. And so he said, instead of using your freedom to do something else, make sure you make a responsible choice. He says that instead of that, use your freedom to serve. Did you recognize that? Let's go back up there to 13. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge in the flesh. In other words, hey, here's the deal. You got more. This freedom brings some responsibility. You can choose now what you do with this freedom. So he says, hey, don't choose to indulge in the flesh, but use your freedom to serve one another humbly in love, right? To serve one another. That's a bit ironic that we would use freedom to serve. That doesn't seem right to me. I figure we should use our freedom to be free to do what we want. That makes sense to us. If I'm going to be free, I want to do what I choose. And then Paul is saying, no, Jesus actually has set you free so that you would serve. Goodness. Like, I don't know if I don't know if I'm okay with that, you know? I mean, I'm American, you know? I'm America, come on. And I like my freedoms. And I want to do what I want to do when I want to do it. I think that's what Paul is acknowledging. Is that, yeah, you're free. You can do what you want to do when you do it. You're welcome to. But he's asking you not to. He said, Jesus is not going to force you. Jesus is not going to, bend your arm. He's just simply saying, hey, you've been given this freedom and now you have a little bit of responsibility. How will you use it? And he's asking them, would you consider, instead of using your freedom, which you are welcome to do, to indulge in the things that make you happy and satisfy you, would you take that freedom and then serve someone else? I think that's a powerful ask, which makes sense because last week Paul said, hey, remember last week when we talked about us learning to count? Another one of those lessons we learned in kindergarten. Paul said, don't let someone convince you to count what doesn't count. In other words, understand what really, truly counts. And he said, and that is faith expressing itself in love. Last week we kind of ended on the question, how do you have faith and express it in love? And I think Paul is now following up and giving us some specifics. He says, you want to know what faith expressing itself in love is? It looks like this. It looks like serving one another humbly, right? Serving one another humbly. I guess then we can still ask the question, but how do we do that? So if we want to have faith expressing itself in love, how do we do that? It's serving one another humbly, but how do you serve one another humbly? There's this danger that comes with freedom. And we see it often in our culture, in our society, right? We see someone who has this issue. Sometimes it's addiction, sometimes we'll fill in the blank or whatever it is, and then they overcome that and they simply then give all of their attention to another bad habit, right? That they've just traded one thing that maybe is pretty bad and they've exchanged it for something else that's not as bad, right? And so they really haven't gained freedom. They've gained freedom from this really bad thing, but now they're enslaved to this not so bad thing, right? So freedom hasn't really taken place. And we have to be careful that Jesus says, hey, I want to give you freedom with grace, but I don't want you to then enslave yourselves to something else. See what happens? You're like, hey, well, I want freedom to do what I want when I want. And so Paul and Jesus are attempting to make the case that you can actually be enslaved to your own personal desires and wishes, which sometimes are not in our best interest. Isn't that the truth? Aren't the things that sometimes we desire for ourselves not good for us? Aren't the things that sometimes we want for our lives and we want for our social standing or our economic standing or maybe just our pleasure, aren't some of those things actually not good for us? Don't some of those things put us in a place that don't agree with what God desires for our life? And I'm saying we're running the gamut from itty bitty tiny things to really big life decision things. That there are things that happen inside of us that pull us towards decisions and desires and wants. And Paul's saying, hey, you have the freedom to choose those things. However, be careful that you don't become a slave to those desires. But you're like, man, but they're my desires. How could those be bad? I wish I had an answer for that. I wish I did. All I know that is in my life, I've wanted some things that I've taken hold of that put me in a terrible place. It put me in a place that was not in alignment with what God desired for my life. It put me in a place that sometimes hurt other people. And that's still something that I will struggle with for the rest of my life. This desire inside of me to want things that are not good for me. Maybe you can identify with that. Maybe right now you're thinking, yeah, this thing, I know it's not good for me, but I just can't shake it. I just can't shake it. There's hope. There's hope. We continue on with Galatians 5, chapter 14. He says, "For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command, love your neighbor as yourself." Man, we've heard that before, right? The entire law, he's trying to make this point, right? He's building one on top of the other. He says, hey, there's been a grace that's been given to you where you are now not accountable to the desires of the law. You're not accountable to that because grace has now covered you. And so don't let anyone mess with your grace. Don't mess with anyone else's grace. And this grace has now given you a freedom. And with that freedom comes responsibility because that freedom has given you an opportunity to choose what you want to do with it. And so he says, then be careful. Don't simply take your freedom where you are free from the law and become enslaved to your own desires for things that are actually not good for you. Instead, keep that freedom and become a servant or a slave of others. How do we practice the only thing that counts, faith expressing itself in love? Well, it's simple, right? That's a simple phrase of love your neighbor as yourself, right? Now we're getting somewhere. Love your neighbor as yourself. It says the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. And if your response is, well, who is my neighbor though? Right? I get love and I get how to love myself, but who's my neighbor? If that's your question, that's a whole other message. And in fact, Jesus goes very specifically into the definition of that neighbor, but it's not something we're going to talk about this morning because I think for most of you, your question is not who's my neighbor. You recognize that your neighbor is the person standing in front of you whenever you're in front of someone. That's your neighbor. Whoever it is, they're standing in front of you at that moment. That's your neighbor. But I think that's the wrong question. I don't think the question should be, who is my neighbor? I think the question should be, how do I love my neighbor as myself? Most people, when they think of God, they think of a bunch of thou shalt nots. If they were to put together a list of desires, if you were to just ask a random person on the street who is not a follower of Jesus, in fact, there's probably actually many followers of Jesus that might actually answer the question this way. And he would say, hey, tell me what God desires, right? What does God want from us? What does God desire for us? They might say, oh, well, let me quote these 10 commandments, thou shalt not, and fill in the blank. And the chances are they might not even know all 10 commandments. They might actually have 12 or 13, or if we're completely honest, most people can't even think of 7 out of the 10, right? If we're really trying to put people to the test, you know? And or they kind of mix them together and they make a thou shalt that actually isn't a thou shalt, all those things. Most people think God is a list of things that or has a list of things he doesn't want us to do. Yet here Paul's trying to make the case that what God really wants is he wants to tell you exactly how you should live, not how you shouldn't live. And so he begins this idea of, hey, if you want to take the entire law and you really need it summed up, here it is. Love your neighbor as yourself. For me, that's a God that I would like to worship and follow. Not a God full of rules and don'ts and these, that, and the others. But a God that says, hey, let me show you what it looks like to actually follow me. Love your neighbor as yourself. Paul's saying the opposite here when he tells us what to do. He's giving us the next thing to do so that we don't simply sit around and fall into some bad trap. He said, hey, if you've been given freedom from the law, freedom from your sin, he said, hey, and in that freedom, sometimes when we have nothing to do, sometimes when we're bored, that's when we fall into some bad habits. So he's saying immediately, the moment that you recognize you've been freed, then, hey, here's your next thing you ought to be doing. Keep yourself busy. You should love your neighbor as yourself. I guess the really good question is, how do we love ourselves? That's a really good question. How do we love ourselves? The answer to that question, that's where it's at this morning. How do we love ourselves? And when we recognize the answer to that, it then allows us to love our neighbor, the person standing in front of us. I think the answer to that question of how you love yourself begins with, do you recognize that you are loved? That you're cared for? That you're significant? That you have worth? I know for moms, a lot of time, you recognize that in the love that you receive from your children. But let me talk to the moms real quick that aren't moms yet. And maybe you've been trying to be a mom for a while, and it just hasn't happened. Maybe you've been thinking, this is what I want, and it just hasn't worked out just yet. Would you trust me enough for me to tell you that God loves you beyond measure, and that the difficulty you're having right now isn't a reflection of that love and care? That God's walking with you through this trouble. That He's walking with you through the struggles that you are having. I hope you trust me enough to believe me, because it's true. And I know sometimes, based upon what we can achieve ourselves, we then dictate whether or not we can love ourselves. Or we receive the love and affection and our self-worth from the way someone else loves us. And I'll say maybe that's where we get a little misguided when it comes to how we love our neighbors. It's because sometimes we don't know how to love ourselves very well. And so then we don't really know how to love our neighbors very well either. But I think the basis of this has to be, how did God love us? How does God love us? How does Jesus love us? And that teaches us then how we can begin to love ourselves as a very unique creation of God. One with gifts and talents, destinies and dreams, all of those things. I think that's an important question that we have to ask. I think it's one that requires an answer. But I have an even bigger question. When's the last time you bit someone? Right? I'm serious. Think back. Like right now, when's the last time you bit someone? Can you put it in the comments? I mean, if it's going to get you in trouble legally, I don't know if I would if I were you. Like if it was like last week at the supermarket because the lady got the last tomato or something, and you're like, that's it, I'm a biter, and you bit her, like I wouldn't put that out there because she's probably looking for you right now. But other than that, when is the last time you bit someone? And I'm trying to think. I mean, like Mike Tyson. Well, not Mike Tyson bit you. I mean, I'm not saying like you took off a piece of ear, that kind of thing. And no, I'm not talking about the little nibble on the ear, fellas. I ain't talking about that. I'm talking about bit someone. You know what I'm saying? Like, how long ago was it? When was it? Maybe you were like my 3-year-old kindergarten teacher, and you bit your own kid to teach them don't bite someone. Or maybe, no, hold on. I wasn't their own kid. Maybe you're like my 3-year-old kindergarten teacher and you bit someone else's kid to teach them a lesson. Like, you know what? Your parent's not around, but you sure need a parent right now, and I'm going to bite your arm to teach you not to bite my baby's arm. I don't know. When's the last time you bit someone? I don't know. That's a really good question. I mean, I'm thinking right now in my head when the last time I bit someone. It's been a while. It's been a while. And I'm not going to put it in the comments right now, but maybe you will. Maybe you will. This is what Paul fears. This right here. And he's set us up for us to understand, for us to recognize, for us to have a really good idea that, hey, Jesus really has changed everything. That up until Jesus, there was this enormous set of expectations called the law. And people couldn't live up to the law. And in fact, that was the point. The law wasn't made for us to live up to it. It was made for us to recognize just how much we needed Jesus. And so Jesus comes, and then churches are planted based upon what Jesus does, the work of Jesus, the person of Jesus. And these churches are planted and they receive this grace. And then these other people come in and they're like, hey, you know what? You actually have to obey this law. Even though grace got rid of, fulfilled, completed that law. They say, hey, no, you got to live with this law. And so Paul comes back and says, hey, no. Grace is given to you whether you can meet the requirements of the law or not. And the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself in love. And then a couple of verses later, he says, and here's the thing, that grace has given you a freedom. But with that freedom comes great responsibility. And you get to choose. You can go from slavery to this law, and you can become slaves to your own self and selfish wants and desires. Or you can use your freedom to serve one another, to have your faith and express it in love. And how do you do that? You simply love your neighbor as yourself. He's attempting to make this jump with us, and he says, but this is what I fear in verse 15. He says, if you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. Watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. When's the last time you bit someone? When's the last time you bit someone? When's the last time someone bit you? It hurts, doesn't it? Oftentimes it leaves a mark. Paul had this fear that we would bite and devour one another. He took my toy, so I bit him. She put her hands in my face, so I bit him. I was bored and you happened to be close, so I bit him. He was a black guy taking a jog down the middle of the street. He looked like somebody who had stole something. So I bit him. Paul says, I just want you to serve the person in front of you. You see, people who are actively loving the people in front of them will not respond with biting when something goes wrong. They respond with heartbreak. That's how you know if you're really loving your neighbor, is when things don't go your way, your heart breaks because of it. Which means you've put yourself in a very vulnerable place. Vulnerability leads us to the greatest instances of loving our neighbors. It means that we do not approach them in a place of defense, but we approach them in a place of love and care and compassion. Vulnerability is something that just doesn't have as much value in our culture as I think it should. And that's because we want to protect ourselves. No one likes to get bit. And the thing is that the person standing close to us, they have the freedom to bite us whether we bite or not. And so we naturally enter into relationships guarded. We naturally enter into the opportunities to serve the people that are in front of us, protecting our heart. But it's only in those moments that we are able to truly serve. When we're vulnerable. And we'll know we're vulnerable enough when it doesn't go our way and our hearts break because of it. After all, that's what faith expressing itself in love is. It's not a for sure step in serving. It's a faithful step in serving. Which means that it might put us in a place that hurts us. Isn't that Mother's Day? Isn't that what Mother's Day is? Great women all across the world who are incredibly vulnerable for their children. Man, as a son, I know there have been many times where I've broken the hearts of the moms in my life because they were vulnerable, serving me, serving my siblings. Yet they still do. Vulnerability. When we are vulnerable, when we are serving, when we love our neighbor, those are the moments we are most like Jesus. That's where we have to get. If there's anything you need to remember today, it's that. When we're vulnerable, when we're serving, when we're loving our neighbor, that is when we're most like Jesus. We're going to sing a song just to let that kind of sink in. I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay, and then we'll chat in just a minute. Lindsay?